Good morning, guys. Welcome to another video on Django from us here at the South African South Switzerland Bilateral Research Chair in Blockchain Technology, or simply UJ Blockchain. Today we'll be going through setting up Django, where we will create a new project create a new Django project, and also explain further on how Django works. Okay. So let's get to it. All right. So in this course, I'm going to show you how to install Django per se. In the description, I will put a link to a video on how we install Python. And then we're going to create a Django project and some applications. So what is the difference between a Django project and a Django application? Right. So each application, right, in Django, right, is essentially has a specific task, right? It's created to handle a specific task for your website, right? So you can think of like a Facebook type of system or social media application where you would have like the user management, like in the user management, you'd have to handle things like login, essentially to store the person's profile and all of that. So you could have an application in your website or your e-commerce website where you would manage the login of users. So that would be the user management aspect. And in Django, you could create that as a standalone app to handle that functionality. And then you could also have another application where you essentially handle the loading of maybe resources. Let's think of in an e-commerce situation where that could be like handling or loading the products, right? You could have an application that is especially designed to deal with the product loading. And then you could also have an application where you handle the checkout of the payment or checkout of the product once a user buys the product, right? So each application in Django can have its own database, right? So, and it will essentially have its own functions to control how the data is rendered to the user in HTML templates, right? So now Django uses the model view controller pattern, right? And essentially it's an architecture used for most web frameworks, which is just a play on where we have MVC, right? That's the model viewer controller. This principle states that each application includes 3 separate files, right? Which essentially handles the 3 main pieces of logic, right? So the model is essentially like a, how do I put it? So it defines the structure of your data, right? It could be like a database descriptions, or it can be the base layer to essentially an application, right? And the view is responsible for displaying all or some of the data that the user sees with either HTML and CSS. So it's essentially responsible for the user interface. And then the controller essentially handles how the database and the view interacts, right? So Django, instead of the model view controller, they modified and they essentially use the MVT, otherwise the model view template pattern, where the view controls essentially how some or all of the data is served and is displayed to the user through, like I mentioned, HTML and CSS, or templates, which are just like templates of pages. Essentially, it's responsible for executing the application's user interface. And then the controller, Django, does in the background, Django does all of that, right? So here's an example of, I think I should have put this, of an e-commerce website. So you'd have your Django project, and then in your Django e-commerce website project, you'd have the user management app, you'd have the product management app, and you'd have the checkout management app, right? So before we continue, let us create a project on Django. Okay, so let us begin. And then to create our Django project, I've opened Visual Studio Code. And a good thing to do when you are creating an application, or a Django application, or any application for that matter, is to create a virtual environment, right? So that, and to do that, we do right. So therefore, we've created a virtual environment. And in this virtual environment, we can now install our the dependencies for our project. And in this case, we'll be installing Django and all the things that we need, right? Just gonna wait for it to finish installing. Once that is done, then we can continue. Okay, let me just pause because it seems to be taking quite a while. Okay, done. Great. All right, so now we do a pip install Django. I will pause while it's installing. Okay, I just realized that I didn't activate the virtual environment before I started installing Django, but let's do that. So let's do that. Okay, now that it's activated, you see this vim there, and it's busy installing Django. Oh, okay. So I've opened up a package that I like to install when I'm creating Django projects. But first, let's create a Django. Let's create a Django project, and to do that, we write Django admin, right? Django admin, and then we have to say supposed to be admin and start project, and it's going to call planner, right? And then I'm going to add a dot. And what the dot does, right, it prevents Django from creating a nested project directory for this planner project, right? So we would have something like planner, right? So I don't want that. So I'm just going to create that. And that's going to create the Django project. So now if you see, we have a project. Right? This is our event. This is our planner project. And you can see these are some of the base files that come with Django. Essentially, this is telling Python that this is a module, this is a planner module, and the ASGI, I think that's to deal with uploading to a server or something like that. But we're not really going to get into that. Settings is where essentially you manage the settings of your, well, it's quite self-explanatory, but the settings of your Django application. So sometimes, well, not sometimes, we will come in here and add some things and functionalities to change the base setting. But as you can see, it already comes with a lot of code already there for you, and you are essentially benefiting from the web frameworks handling all the nitty-gritty that you don't normally have to handle if you were starting from scratch. And then the URLs, we will explain. Yeah, I'll explain that to you after I just install this Django live reload. So essentially, this allows you to reload your static and template files. And so let me just install that now. So I'm just saying, and we still have our virtual environment activated. So I'll just say pip install we just copy anyway, I've already started writing Django live reload load server, right? And once that is done, just gonna follow this we're gonna take this, right, and register it into our application. Why did that turn red all of a sudden? Did I do something? Oh, I did do something, so don't do that. Okay. So then I go to my settings and I look for installed apps, or apps rather, installed apps, and then I'm going to put it somewhere there, and I'm just going to paste it and ensure that there's a comma. We will be doing this quite shortly, and then we now have to add the middleware, and they suggest we should add it at the end, so let's just do that. And there's our middleware, and I paste it, and we're good to go. Right, so there's that. And now let's jump into, let me just close, I'll minimize this and increase this. Let's jump into what is a URL in Django. So we're back. What is a URL in Django? Well, what is a URL or route? A uniform resource locator. So that's what a URL stands for. And essentially that is like an address for every single unique resource, right, on the web. It has an address to locate that. And in the hyper as a transfer text protocol, HTTP, it's essentially what is used by web browsers to retrieve and publish resources on the web, right? That's what a URL is. So how is it used in the Django context? Now, so your website has a page, right? Right. So every web page on the internet, right, has to have an URL, right? So this is one, mywebsite.com. And essentially what it is doing is it's letting the clients know what should show to the user when they open the URL, right? So in this, essentially, so the clients, when I say the clients, I'm talking about your web browser, anything that you use as a web browser. So the web browser is going to get this address, and it's going to turn this to like an IP address, which is a set of numbers, and it's going to search for it on a web server where it's hosted, and then return back the content that is on this website, right? So in Django, right, Django uses like a URL configuration file, right? And essentially that is what we store over here. that was what we saw